Hello, my name is Dorris. I'm a paediatric neuropsychologist and I work in the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow and also at the University of Glasgow. And today I'd like to tell you about an exciting new study called Cognitive Empathy Across the Lifespan. And in this study we've used a measure of empathy and we've looked at how empathy abilities might develop across childhood and adolescence, but also how they might change across our lifespan. And we did this using a very large number of participants. So what is empathy? We can define empathy in different ways, but the model I want to use here is that empathy is about the ability to infer and predict the intentions or thoughts, desires or intuitions, behavioural reactions, plans or beliefs of other people, through an awareness that others have a mind with mental states, information and motivations that might differ from our own. And we might think about that as being a way we differentiate empathy from sympathy, where and by using sympathetic judgments, we think how we might feel in a certain situation and project that onto someone else. And we might see someone, for example, fall in the street and hurt themselves, and we would think, gosh, that looks sore. I would feel a certain way. I'm going to respond with some sympathy. But we don't always know that people feel the same way as us, and empathy involves having a kind of deeper understanding where we might suspend our own perspectives and really try to enter into the other person's in our world as much as we can. So cognitive empathy requires cognitive neural circuits to identify and make inferences about the thoughts, intentions and emotional states of others. So it's about a judgment. We might differentiate that from affective empathy. Affect is to do with emotion, and that affective empathy is conceptualized as the ability to make inferences about what someone else is feeling, but also to respond with the appropriate emotion. So in this study, we're thinking more about cognitive empathy, so how we make those basic judgments about how someone else might be thinking or feeling. So we report developmental data on cognitive empathy with a very large cohort using a standardized measure of cognitive empathy ability. So we had 4,545 participants, aged from less than 5 years to over 75 years, and participants were visitors to the Glasgow Science Centre. So participation was voluntary, no identifying information was recorded other than age, sex and occupation. And participants completed a computerised version of the Reading, the Mind and the Eyes test, which is a well-known test of empathy, which is obtainable from the Autism Research Centre at Cambridge. And this test involves viewing the eye region of the human face and selecting a mental state term describing what the person is thinking or feeling. And I'll show you an example of that. So in this test, you're shown the eye region of the human face, and at each corner is a word or a mental state term, and you have to select which word best describes what the person is thinking or feeling. And you can see that both of the stimuli are the same, but for children under 13 years, the words, the mental state terms, are simplified. So each participant was shown 25 of these examples. We also obtained some demographic information about our participants, where we tried to compare visitors to the Glasgow Science Centre to the Scottish population. And one way of doing that was to use a measure of socio-economic status called the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which organises Scotland into almost 7,000 data zones. And from this information, we can see that our participants are very similar to the population. There was a slightly larger amount in the least deprived quintile, and slightly fewer in the most deprived quintile, but not a bad fit for the Scottish population generally. We also examined a few other factors, and we found very similar levels of full-time employment. There was, however, more female visitors to the Science Centre than in the general population. Our visitors were slightly more diverse in terms of ethnicity, so 10% were non-white versus 5% in the population. And also, Glasgow Science Centre visitors were twice as likely to identify as non-heterosexual compared to the general population. So this slide shows the main results for the study, where we plot the score on the empathy test as a function of both age and sex. And the scores for female participants are shown with the blue line with the circles, and the scores for males are the red line with the squares. So if we look at the left-hand side first, we can see that the children less than 6 years of age are unsurprisingly score more poorly on this test. Around the age of around 6 or 7 years, there's a very significant increase as children become more able to use language and build models about thoughts and feelings. And we can see that there's a kind of slow improvement in these abilities across childhood, although progress is a bit more faltering in boys. There's another significant increase in ability around the age of 10 to 12 during this important pre-adolescent phase. And interestingly, we see that boys and girls do about the same on this test of empathy, which I think is really interesting. What happens next is quite intriguing, that we see during adolescence that the scores actually reduce a bit. So that wasn't a statistically significant finding, but there was a consistent reduction in scores in both boys and girls. So it seems as though these cognitive empathy abilities enter a semi-latent developmental period during adolescence. So we're not quite sure why that is. We do know that there's a great deal of maturation goes on, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the frontal lobes of the brain, as these areas increase in terms of myelination and connections with other regions of the brain. So we know that there's a lot going on in terms of development, but nevertheless, most intellectual abilities, most cognitive abilities do continue to increase in a linear way through adolescence. So the fact that there are changes in empathy is quite intriguing. It might also be at a psychological level, adaptive perhaps, to have these changes in empathy. Possibly it helps us to individuate from parents and carers to be part of a group of peers, possibly taking more risks, maybe something about rejection of authority that might have an adaptive function for us. So I think it's just really important that we understand a bit more about what goes on developmentally and cognitively during adolescence. And I would urge you to, if you're interested, to look at the work of Sarah Jane Blakemore in London, who has done some really interesting work on cognition during adolescence. We're also planning a follow-up study to look in a bit more detail during teenage years at how empathy might change and what are the things that might cue teenagers to be more empathic. So then next we see a very significant increase in scores in the third decade of life, so that in our early 20s our cognitive empathy abilities reach a functionally mature level of ability, which largely continues through adulthood and right into our older age. We can also see there's a slight gentle decrease in ability during our 50s and 60s. And then as we get into our 70s, there's a particularly steep decline on these tests of cognitive empathy, particularly in men. Now on that note, you will see from the graph that women tend to outperform men at almost every stage of development. But this rate of decline in older men is particularly notable. So if you are an older person looking at this thinking, oh, that's not good news, then let's get some perspective on it. It's not necessarily going to impact on your day-to-day life. And we do know that as we get older, that actually our friendship quality can, if anything, improve, that we can have greater emotion control and experience more satisfaction in life. So it's not as if having more difficulty in these tests is going to necessarily lead to problems. However, it might be worth bearing in mind that particularly older men might need a bit more support in some situations so that they can use empathy more flexibly and manage relationship difficulties. Or there might be other situations where older men might find themselves in benefiting from a bit more support in that area. If we have older relatives, it might be worth bearing in mind that we could possibly be more to signal how we're thinking and feeling with more information or detail. And if you are an older man, then perhaps it might help to ask more questions and show more curiosity around how someone's thinking or feeling. But again, there will be many men who at an individual level are extremely good at these abilities right through their lifespan. So we are talking about group average performances. We also looked at the occupations of participants and then converted that data into Office for National Statistics codes. So the ONS is a UK government organisation which looks at employment data. And using the ONS codes, we found that there was a significant linear relationship between employment category and score on the cognitive empathy test. So the more senior your occupational code, the better you did on the test. And perhaps that's not surprising, because cognitive empathy is a cognitive ability which likely correlates quite highly with other cognitive abilities. We know that employment status does correlate with educational attainment, which in turn has a moderate correlation with IQ. So it's perhaps unsurprising then that people with higher occupational code did better on this test of cognitive empathy. So in summary then, we've found that cognitive empathy is a late developing ability which can change across the lifespan. Cognitive empathy increases during childhood, but enters a semi-latent developmental period during adolescence. And I think we need to know more about this so that we can meet the educational needs of young people, and that we can offer them appropriate social and emotional support during this time of significant change. And also worth bearing in mind that the behaviour of young people does reflect their cognitive development, and making sure that we understand how those processes can change. Also, we know that empathy matures during early adulthood and gradually declines in older age, particularly in men. So there may be situations where older men in particular might require a bit more support in order to use empathy appropriately and to manage relationships and judgments. But clearly there's going to be a lot of individual variation, so many older men will continue to have very good cognitive empathy abilities. We're talking in generalities here. And we also confirm previous reports of a female advantage in cognitive empathy ability, which has been widely replicated. And as I said earlier, for those of you who are particularly interested in cognition during the teenage years, I would direct you to the excellent work of Sarah Jane Blakemore. So I hope this study has, if anything, just raised more questions for you and increased your interest in this really important human ability of empathy, which I'm sure we'll agree is something we could do with seeing more of in society. So thanks very much for your attention, and if you're interested, the paper is available in the journal Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology. So thanks for your attention.